In and out of office as either legal president or de facto dictator, Calles dominated the next decade of Mexican politics from 1924 to 1934. Building on the foundations that Obregón had laid, he continued his work with much the same methods. His radical phraseology tended to conceal the very pragmatic, moderate essence of his policy, which was to promote the rapid growth of the Mexican national capitalism, whose infrastructure he helped to establish. To strengthen the fiscal and monetary system, he created the Bank of Mexico, the only bank permitted to issue money. This was shortly after the United States had done the same thing. A National Road Commission was organized, and a national electricity code was enacted to aid the electric power industry. These measures stimulated the growth of construction and consumer goods industries, in which members of Calles' official family, or the revolutionary family, as the ruling elite came to be called, were heavily involved. Protective tariffs, subsidies, and other forms of aid were generously extended to industries, both foreign and domestic. In 1925, an assembly plant of the Ford Motor Company began operations in Mexico after Calles and the company negotiated an agreement providing for numerous concessions. Calles showed more enthusiasm for land redistribution than Obregón, and the tempo of land redistribution increased sharply during his presidency. Like Obregón, Calles regarded land reform as a sort of a safety valve for peasant unrest. During the 4 years of his term, Calles distributed about twice as much land as Obregón. But the other side of that coin was less than 1/4 of that amount consisted of arable land, for Calles did not require the hacendados to surrender productive land, and most of the land given up came from pasture or forest lands or even land that was completely barren. Nor did Calles make a serious effort to provide the peasantry with irrigation, fertilizer, implements, or seed. He established a government bank that was supposed to lend money to the ejidos to promote modern farming techniques and act as agents for the sale of their produce. But 4/5 of the bank's resources were loaned not to ejidos but to hacendados because they had much superior credit ratings, and many of the bank's agents took advantage of their position to enrich themselves at the expense of the peasants. It was a corrupt system. So under these conditions, it is no wonder that land reform soon appeared to be a failure. By 1930, grain production had fallen below the levels of 1910, and Calles, concluding that peasant proprietorship was economically undesirable, announced the abandonment of land distribution. Meanwhile, in his own large estates, Calles introduced machinery and other modern agricultural techniques and advised other large landowners to do the same. In this way, it was not unlike Porfirio Diaz. The ejido was just not efficient at producing the large volumes of agricultural output needed for a modern state. Now, like Obregón, Calles regarded labor unions as desirable because they helped stabilize labor-capitalist relations and avert radical social change. But by the end of the Callista decade, Mexican labor, disillusioned with a corrupt leadership that kept wages at or below subsistence level, had begun to break away from the Crom umbrella and form independent unions. Here we see Calles in the U.S. visiting the AFL headquarters. Now, Calles continued the Carranza and Obregón policies of asserting Mexico's right to regulate the conditions under which foreign capital could exploit its natural resources. But he was far from hostile to foreign capital. Indeed, he gave assurances that the government will do everything in its power to safeguard the interest of foreign capitalists to invest money in Mexico, unquote. Here we see him with former President Taft, who's lost some weight, and President Calvin Coolidge. So we don't make the mistake of Diaz selling out the entire nation, but we do want to, if we can, attract some foreign investment. But a serious dispute with the United States arose in 1925 when the Mexican Congress passed laws to implement Article 27. This was that article of the Constitution of 1917 that regulated the subsoil. And it required owners of oil leases to exchange their titles for 50-year concessions dating from the time of acquisition, to be followed, if necessary, by 30-year renewals with the possibility of yet another extension if needed. So this was not radical. Far from injuring the foreign oil companies, the law actually eliminated the vagueness and doubt cast on their status under Article 27. It gave them firm titles emanating from the government and served to quiet more radical demands for the government just to outright take the oil wells, outright nationalization. However, a number of American oil companies took exception, denounced the law as confiscating their oil, and threatened to continue drilling operations without these confirming concessions. The State Department of the U.S. vigorously protested this restrictive legislation, again, although it wasn't that restrictive, and the U.S. Ambassador, James R. Sheffield, pursued a very hard-line, uncompromising policy. By late 1926, the United States appeared to be moving toward war with Mexico. Fortunately, the interventionist policy came under severe attack from progressive Republican senators. Of course, they were isolationists, and they were tired of, as you'll recall, global adventurism after World War I. And so President Calvin Coolidge and Secretary of State Kellogg realized that war with Mexico would have little national support. So they sought a way out of the impasse and were aided by U.S. international bankers who had a firmer grasp of Mexican policies and intentions. And the appointment of Dwight Morrow as ambassador to Mexico, he was, by the way, a partner in J.P. Morgan. The appointment of him as ambassador in September of 1927 really marked a turning point in the crisis. Morrow managed to persuade Calles that portions of the oil law had the potential for injuring foreign property rights. And the result was the Mexican Supreme Court found unconstitutional that portion of the law setting a time period on the concessions. But as rewritten, the law still provided for confirming concessions and reaffirmed national ownership of the Mexican subsoil. So the result was sort of a compromise.